Hello everybody and welcome to part 4 of the Blender tutorial series for CSC 210. Today I'm going to be going over a few concepts regarding what we refer to as UV mapping and materialization. So these are going to be some methods and techniques you can use to make your objects appear how you want them to beyond just being a solid object. So this is how they're going to get their look like metallic or texture on them, stuff like that. So the first thing I'm going to do in this scene is add what we call an HDRI, which is a specific type of image that can be used as essentially a sky dome. And the nice thing about this is that it reflects light in your scene, so it acts as a light source to your scene, but it does it based on the color of that image that wraps around the scene. You'll see what I mean once we get in there. A place that you can find HDRIs, you can just search HDRIs for free on Google and it'll return some results. I usually go to HDRI Haven, I believe is the website, and they have lots of very high resolution, nice indoor and outdoor HDRIs. So in order to apply this, you need to go into this tab here, this little red world context tab, and this controls your background of the scene. So for our color, we're going to want to import an environment texture for this, and then we're going to hit open, and if I go to my downloads folder, I have a few right here. You can see an HDR, Cape Hill, and Cayley interior. We'll go with the Cape Hill one for now, and I think that'll work well. So if I open that up, you can see nothing really changed. That's because I'm in this regular mode and I'm not viewing through my camera. So if I hit 0 on my numpad, it'll bring me in my camera. And then if I go into, there we go, into render mode up here, you can see there's now a nice background. Now you can jump out of this and you can see there's this big HDRI around us. However, if you are in perspective mode, which is up here in view, perspective ortho, it won't show you the background and you get this weird light flickering effect. A lot of times they will end up working in perspective mode while an HDRI is active, but you don't necessarily get the right effect. So you have to be in perspective for that to work correctly. So as you can see, there's some sunlight over there, and it's properly affecting our light in the scene. I'm just going to remove this light that already existed from the standard so that we're getting more accurate HDRI. You can scale this up to make it brighter or darker to make it less apparent, but we're going to leave it at 1 for right now. And I'm going to introduce you to the first node in the node setup that I feel may be very useful for lots of different applications. So all of our materials, and this HDRI is also a material for our background, can be built through what we call the physically based shader setup, PBR graphs. And they all have different nodes in them that determine how to calculate those materials. So if I drag a new tab by going up in the corner here and pulling over, and then go into this menu for the editor and select shader editor, this will bring up a graph here. Now if I click on the cube here, you can see it's bringing up my first material for the cube here, which is just a principled shader that feeds into our material output here. And this is our principled shader here in the shader menu for that object that we've used before. You can see here is the principled shader, and here's the principled shader as well. The very nice thing about these graphs is that you can plug in whatever you want into any of these. So if you go up to add, there's lots of different things to work with. I'm not going to be covering all of these. There's some of these that I've never even used before. However, these will let you do essentially whatever you want. If you're looking for something specific, you can search for it and see if it exists. If it doesn't exist, you can look it up online. There's probably a plugin for it that you can download and install into Blender. But back to our background, our HDRI. If I switch up here in my node editor to World instead of Object, this will bring up my HDRI. And you can see right here I have this node right here, which is a image texture feeding into my background shader type and coming out as my world output. So this vector input allows us to change the direction that this is facing and its scaling and all that. So if I add a few things here, so we're going to use a texture coordinate node and a mapping node. And the texture coordinate node isn't necessarily needed in this context, but in some contexts you might need it. So we're going to feed this vector into here. So this is the output of our mapping node, and it's going into our HDRI. And you can see that already changed things. We don't like what's going on here. So we're going to take the generated and plug that into our vector. That's the generated texture coordinate plane for that image. What that means isn't necessarily important at the moment, but what is important is this mapping node. So if I zoom in on this mapping node so you can see it a little better, we have some different things that we can manipulate. And keep in mind that you can also keyframe these, like we talked about in the last episode. You can keyframe these to be animated. So if I wanted my scene to rotate, I could animate that instead of just setting it. But you can see already that changing these allows us to rotate in scale. Oops, there we go, it's a 1. So if I wanted this to look lower, I would drag this down on the z-axis. However, this isn't going to do exactly what you want because of the way that HDRI images work, so you can see that this is stretching way out, which isn't necessarily what we want. The most important one is going to be scaling and rotation. Location, not as much. If you did want to move it off to the side a little bit, you could. But most of the time you're going to want to be rotating these probably on the Z to get a different light angle on your scene. Or also scaling, and I would suggest scaling these all the same. So if I wanted this to be much closer in, I could scale these all on 2. We're going to leave them all at 1. This is just to show you that these are you can manipulate these and do what you want with your background. But the purpose of my background in this example is just so that when we're looking at more materials for our objects, you can see the changes in them because we have a dynamic scene. So, if we go back to our cube here, our cube object, and I hit Object up here and select my cube, there's my shader. The principled shader is a great starting point for many things. You can do a lot of different things with the principled shader, and as you can see it has lots of different inputs. Again, I'm not going to go over what all of these are, but I'll show you some things that may help get you on the right track. If I wanted this cube to appear like a metal cube, I would drag up the metallic shader. I'm just going to do it all the way, bring down my specular all the way, and drag my roughness down quite a bit. If I bring it down to 0, it's basically a mirror finish on that cube, as you can see. However, most things have some form of roughness, so we're just going to bring it up a little bit. There you can see, so it's still reflective, but it's a little more accurate in its reflection to what a realistic one would be. A specular map, or a specular shader, I should say, is different than a metallic one. So if I drag the metallic all the way down and the specular all the way up, you can see that that's not doing much. It's still kind of reflective, but this is meant for hard surface objects that are not metal. In the early days of materialization in computers and shader development, the specular and albedo workflows were commonplace. They were used for everything. So this isn't used as much anymore now that we have much more advanced shader types. However, specular still does the job very well for lots of things, so don't be afraid to use specular. If you wanted this to be even shinier, you could bring up the clear coat to 100, or to 1 I should say, and you can see that that changes that. You can bring our roughness even down on that. IRQ is something that has to do with refraction. So refraction is how light bounces through transparent materials like glass or crystals. It does have to do with absorption on surfaces as well, I believe. In this case, changing it probably doesn't do much for us. And if you wanted to find out what the exact IRQ of like diamond is, or what of a specific type of glass is, you could look that up online, because those physical properties do actually exist, and then you could accurately put it in here and get the desired effect. So if you really wanted to make auto glass for a car, you could look up what auto glass's IRQ typically is, type that in, and that would probably work out really well. There is a specific glass shader. So this is the principled shader, as I was talking about. We can delete that. And then you can either add your shader over here in the surface of the object, or you can add it up here under shader. And we'll add in a glass one. Bring that into surface. And we now have a glass cube sitting here. Again, this one has an IRQ. There's a few different calculation types, Beckman, Sharp, GCX. You're probably not going to see too much difference in Eevee. We'll keep it on Beckman. And you can change the color of your glass and everything. It does look relatively reflective. We can add a little bit of roughness to it, so on and so forth. But you can see that it kind of looks like we're looking through this glass pane. It's a yellow tint. Make it maybe a little blue. Could even scale it down on the X a little bit more to make it more look like a glass pane. It reflects light like a glass pane would. We can bring down the IRQ. It's much flatter, you can't really see through it. Bring up the IRQ, it becomes kind of hazy. So again, the IRQ does actually affect refraction quite a bit, so keep that in mind. I think a 2, yep, see, that changed the way that it's working. 1 basically has little to no effect on what you're looking at. If I deselect the glass, you can barely see it there. But anyway, so that is that. We're going to put a principled shader back in. So I'm just going to put the principled right back in here, drag it back to surface. If you wanted to have something as a volume instead of a surface, delete that, add in a transparent shader, and keep it white like that. Bring that into our surface, and then add in a volume. We'll do a volume scatter. Put that in there. And bring that up. We'll also scale this back out on the X a bit so you can see it's doing some strange things. Generally, and I don't know exactly how this works in Eevee because I don't use Eevee as much as I use cycles, but generally if you put a transparent shader on your surface of the object, then you can do whatever you want inside of the object with another shader for the volume. I don't deal with that much. That's for if you want to make a mist object, but there's other ways to do that, so I generally don't do it through shaders. We can add back in our principled like I was going to do. There we go. Okay. So this supports many different things that we can work with. Emissive materials. So if I wanted this to be emit light, I could. So if I bring that up and then I go back over here to my world, I'm just going to bring this strength down to 0.1, and you can see that this is still showing up and it's emitting light. I could bring it down to 0, and you can see it's still visible. This is very good if you're trying to make materials that emit light. Now keep in mind it doesn't give off halo effects, so if you want to have like a light emission effect right around the edge, so it looks like it's emitting light, that's not what this does. That's a post-processing effect. That's a whole different ball game. However, this will emit light and it will be reflected by other objects in the scene. So if I duplicate my cube with Shift D, and then we'll just drag it over here, we'll scale it up a bit, and we'll create a new material for it. So I'm just going to hit this right here, which creates a new material. And we're going to bring our emission back down to nothing. And we'll bring our metallic all the way up on it, bring our specular down, bring our roughness down, drag this away. This isn't showing up in the reflection very easily, and I think I know why that is. And it has to do with the way that Eevee renders things, so I'm not going to be concerned about that. But if I do switch to cycles, it should work, as I'm trying to explain. There we go. So you can see now in cycles, it's appearing in the reflection. The reason that this is happening is because of the way that Eevee calculates reflections, so that's the reason it doesn't show up in that respect right there. I could get into why that happens. It's this thing called screen space reflections, but you can see that that looks pretty awful. We can make it look better, but it's going to be rough. If you want screen space reflections, it's not going to... You can see how this face isn't appearing. That's because it's going off of what it can see here and calculating it here. So you can see as soon as I see this face, it sees that face there. This is fairly unimportant. You don't need to be worrying about this. You can still do this in Eevee. Don't feel like you have to use cycles, but if you really want that realistic reflection, cycles is the way to go. So we're not going to be worrying about that. Going back to our cube here, we can put in a bunch of different things into these here. So I'm going to bring up a different file that I have that I rendered, and I'll show you a more advanced setup and explain to you what's going on. So I'm going to go to File, Open Recent, and I'm going to open up this one right here. I'm going to discard these changes. Okay. So this is just a render I made a while ago. If I hit the render key here, it'll take a minute to load because there's quite a bit going on in this scene. But you'll see that there's a lot of different materials going on here, including textures on each of these Lego characters here. So you can see that this guy has a different texture on his body than this guy, and they're all unique in that respect. So if I select this guy right here, his body, and I'm just going to go back into material mode here so it's not taking up so much render power. And I'm going to drag this over again and open up my shader editor. You can see that this shader has some more things going on in it. So essentially, I have my generated texture coordinate and my mapping node, and these are determining where the image from the UV unwrapping is going to end up, and then these are the images that are being applied to that UV map. So this one is a mask, which is a black and white image that can be used to determine where you want color and where you don't want color for things. And that's going into my factorization for mixing this principled shader with this principled shader. And this principled shader is just taking in straight color from an image that I've drawn to make these rings. And then this color is going in based on where it's white and black on this map to come into this mix and output what you see right here on his body. So just to quickly recap, this tells us where the image goes. This tells us where the proper coloring goes over here in the mix. This is the color for the rings. This is what determines the material, which is the rings. Color and material are different things because this applies physical properties. And then this applies that background color to the object, and then this is our output. So the reason I have two different shaders here is because the rings actually have a different physical property because they're meant to look like paint. This has a flatter, more specular look with a different roughness value than this does. And this has a clear coat, whereas this doesn't. So this is fairly advanced. Don't feel like you need to do anything like this. This is just to give you a little bit of an overview as to what you can do with these node setups. And this is actually not as in-depth as you would think it is. You can do this if you really wanted to, and I'd be happy to help you out with it. So if I go to the UV editor, I'll show you this in a second. You'll see where the image lines up based on this map, and then I'll show you how to do UV unwrapping. So UV unwrapping, or what I should explain is the UV map and UV unwrapping first, is how the faces of an object are represented in 2D space. So this Lego body piece here, it needs to be represented on a flat plane so that we can apply an image to that flat plane. So if I go into the UV editing world here, and I select his body, which I do have selected here, and I go into edit mode, and I'll select all here, you can see all these different faces here are part of the body. Now, this piece here is really big because this is where I want the detail. So I want the detail on the front of his body, so it's huge. These pieces are much smaller and unimportant because they don't need texturing, so they can be very small on our map. You can see here that this is how our ring texture is currently going to be applied to our body, but you also have to keep in mind that I had that texture mapping node that's going to offset and scale that just a little bit differently so that I got it how I wanted. Keep in mind that if you have a face on something, you're going to want to make sure that the faces of that face are going to be bigger on your UV map so that you can get the most detail on the face. If your person wants to have a nice looking smile, but you don't care what the back of their head looks like, make sure you make the faces for that smile big. And that's how you apply that. So if I go back, I'm going to open up a new file again. We don't need to save our changes. And I'm just going to delete everything here. Add in a cube. When you go into edit mode, there's this menu here called UV. There's lots of different things you can do in this menu, and I'll show you how to use a few of them. But this is how you unwrap your object onto a 2D plane. So I come over here and I open up the UV editor. You can see because I imported this cube, it already has a map that's determined how you would maybe want a cube to be laid out. When working with multiple windows, you can select a face and see which face it corresponds to on your UV map. If I select everything here, everything shows up over here. Keep in mind that that's different than selecting over here. If I hit A while I'm in this window, I can select all, or B to box select, I can select these points, and then I can do anything that I would do in the editor window like I would over here. So I can use G to change the location if I wanted it to be only on the X or only on the Y, hit X or Y respectively. I can scale all this with S. I can scale it on the X, the Y, just like you would in the other window. And I can also rotate it and specify degrees like 60 by putting that in. I want to do that too. Keep in mind that these points are still connected, so if I have this one, you can see it's still connected to those other faces. This may not be what you want. Like you saw before, I had the front of the body completely disconnected. So let's say I wanted this face, this middle one, to be very large compared to everything else on my cube. Okay. I would go into the edge editor, so I have these 4 edges selected, go into the edge menu, and do what I'm going to call mark a seam. You can see that these are now a darker orange color, and now if I go into UV and unwrap, and then select everything, this face should be different than everything else. Let me see here if I can... So if I go here and I box select this, and I'll just grab it and move it, you can see now that that's disconnected from everything else, which is very nice. So now, I could select all of these points, and deselect these, scale this down, press G to move it, hit Alt-A to deselect, B to box select, scale this up, G to grab and move, and now I have a nice large face that I can draw on and use for higher detail. You can do a few different ways of unwrapping. This is if you want to get things to look really nice, you can unwrap this way and have a lot of control over what faces are where and how big they are and what's connected and what's not. It can be really tedious when you have very high poly objects where you have lots of verts that you're worrying about where they're going. I'm going to switch to orthographic mode here so that we're just looking at this face on the sphere, or on the cube. And I'm going to do what's called a cube projection. This is basically taking every face and just laying it over the top of each other. So every face on this cube is going to be the exact same. Like I grab this point, you can see that I'm controlling it, but there's still another face underneath it. There are 6 layers sitting here. So if I hit Alt-A, box select, I can scale them all down, but they're still all going to be the same size. Another way to achieve this is, like I am in orthographic mode, projecting from view. If you select everything first. So whatever you select is what it's going to project. So if I only select this face, it'll only unwrap that. I need to unwrap everything. So UV, project from view. The problem with this now is, though, because I have everything selected, these side faces are only lines, whereas the rest, these 2, are faces. These are only edges. Now again, I can grab and pull these because they're just points on top of each other, but essentially I took exactly what I'm looking at here and just projected it here, which isn't necessarily what you want if you're doing an entire object. I understand this may be a lot to keep up with. This is mostly for reference, so if you need to know how to do something, you have a starting point. Again, feel free to ask me on these things. Don't feel like you need to absorb all of this. It's a lot to take in, and I understand that. So, another way that you can do this is if we select all the faces and hit Smart UV Project. This will open up a small menu, and you can change these values. This will disconnect every single face for you so that you don't have any connected objects. The problem with this is that sometimes they're not weighted well and small faces end up taking up more space than large ones. It works well for the most part, but sometimes you'll get really pixelated faces, especially if you're using smaller texture sizes. So you can see here we got these 6 faces. It's a pretty clean looking nice map. Nothing's connected, so you won't have any bleed over if you want these all to look nice and clean. So we'll go with this this nice setup here for texture painting. So what I'm going to do is go into material mode up here, and I'm just going to go over here to my materials and add a new material again. and we'll go into texture paint mode. Actually, I'm going to go into the texture paint layout up here. Okay. So this might get a little confusing to everybody, so just keep with me. I'm going to look at this from the side again. Texture slots are what we're going to be drawing a texture onto. So now that we have our material, we can add a texture slot. So I'm just going to hit add here, and it's going to be base color, and we'll just call this cube base or something like that. 1024 is a decent size. If you want something to have a lot of detail, you could bump that up to 2048, even 4096. I wouldn't make it any bigger than that. Going smaller than this, though, if you're going to have a large object, things might start to look pixelated. So we'll just leave it at 1024 for now, but I am going to bring this all the way up to full white. If you're going to be using masks in any way, like I described in the node setup I had for the other one, you want to make sure you have absolute blacks, absolute whites, or absolute alphas, because otherwise things get off color. So I just tend to keep things as one of those three. So I'm going to hit OK. You can see this is now white. So up here we have some tools for coloring, and we can grab this and bring it over to green and draw on here, and that face is now green. If we go over in here and look at our cube base, you can see down here it has updated our texture so that that face is green. I can go up here, change this color to yellow. That one's now yellow. And come over here, make this one blue. That one's now blue. Now keep in mind, if I'm looking at this from an angle, I can color right across them, and you can see weird things happen when we do that. It's not necessarily what we want. There's also different brush types up here. So if I wanted to be burning this color in, I could do that. You can see it's getting darker. There's a lot of different things you can do in that respect. So also having a strength of 1 for things like this might help as well, because then you know you're getting the absolute color that you're looking for if you're using mix. So if we use mix, we're going to get the exact color that we're looking for. In order to prevent, if you want to be coloring on something from an angle, in order to prevent this from going to multiple faces, if we go into edit mode and select a single face that we want to be drawing on, and then we go into texture paint mode again and press this button right here. This is our paint mask. So now you can see that it's highlighted that single face that we want. So if I want this face to be red, I can color at it from an angle, and it won't bleed over because we're only doing that. If I turn this off, I can bleed over. So now we have an RGB cube. Look at that, isn't that nice? You can also paint with stencils. So we can basically take a texture and apply that onto an object as well. So if I go into my brush and add a new texture here, and then I open up, we'll go to here, my textures folder, metal textures, tileable scratch with rust. Sure, open that up. You can see now I have this texture here, and then if I go in here, select my texture, and I go to stencil, this is now here, and I can right click and drag that shift, right click, scale it down. I have this stencil here, and then I can draw over that stencil, and it appears on my object. So keep in mind that you can do this as well, and you can do it over here too. So if I wanted this face only to be this metal scratch texture, not in green though, let's go to full white. Let's change my color here to RGB1 all the way up, and just color over this. that whole face is now scratched metal texture. And you can color over it again. But keep in mind you can do that on both of the screens that you're using. So, in order to save this image, we have to pack it into our blend file. You can save it as an external image, or we can hit pack here. But if you go into File, and then go to External Data, you can check this box to automatically port or pack all files into Blend. You can see it packed one file. So now, this is extremely important if you're going to be using textures like this. That is part of our blend file. If you did not pack that in and you didn't save it externally, when you close Blender, it loses that because that texture is just sitting in memory and it's not saved anywhere. So you need to pack that into the file so that when the file is saved, it saves that as well. Very important so that you don't lose that progress that you've made with your careful texture painting. So you could make your own textures in an external 2D software like Photoshop or GIMP. You could find textures like this online. You can find alpha textures or black and white textures, and then you can make those into maps, and then you can apply that map like I showed you before with a mix to get like where you put rusty scratches on metal with a rust texture, or with a rust material and a paint material. There's a lot of different possibilities. And this stuff can get very in-depth and very complex fast. So again, we're not expecting you to get very in-depth with this stuff, especially in introductory course. However, I do want to give you the tools that you need to understand it, and I'm very happy to help you out with it if you do want to explore it and work with these things. Because it's a very artistic thing to do, and therefore you can get things to look like what you want instead of just having these diffuse objects that are one color, or just changing the face colors on things through material slots like I showed you in the first tutorial with the tree. So these are just a few different things that'll get you started with this stuff. You can also have multiple textures per object and apply those in your material nodes. There's lots of different things to do. I think that's all I'm going to go over for now. There is more I could get into, but I don't want to overwhelm everybody with this information. So feel free to experiment with these things, get a few textures in your project perhaps, draw a face on something, do what you want to. And I hope that this helps everybody out and gives you a little more insight into the UV maps and the materials that we have available to work with in Blender. So good luck, and let me know if you need any assistance. Thanks.